I would like to welcome Riccardo Manzotti. He's going to give a very interesting talk about Out of My Head on a Trail of Consciousness.
Thank you very much. Tonight I will try to challenge one of your beliefs, namely that we are inside our body, namely that we see the world from the vantage point of our body. And I will try to provide you with a completely different view of what we are. I will try to suggest to you that we are actually out of our body, out of our head. And so you will understand why I brought with me an apple and a brain. And I will try to convince you that between these two objects, the object that has the better chance that it is closer to what we are is not the brain, but rather it is the apple. And the apple, of course, will be used as an example for the world. Not just, I'm not claiming that we are just fruits, but I'm claiming that we are the objects that surrounds us, rather than being the objects that are inside our body, like the brain, no matter how complex they are. This idea has been presented by me with a name, which is the spread mind. And if you're interested, you can check on my website, and you can see it there, that addresses the issue of the nature of consciousness. What is consciousness? Well, consciousness, which is our everyday experience, is actually the biggest mystery in science. There are many mysteries in science. What is dark matter? What is the origin of the universe? But the biggest mystery of all is likely inside us. What is our experience? And why do I say that it is a mystery? Because nothing in science predicts the fact that we are conscious. Everything we know from neuroscience doesn't support the fact that we are conscious. Of course, neurosciences told us a lot of stuff about how our brains work, about how we perceive the world, how we recognize other people, how we control the movement of our body. But it doesn't say anything about the fact that we have an experience of the world. Actually, if people didn't report, I feel something, neuroscientists wouldn't have a clue that a person feels something. So what happened to me, let me tell you one thing about me. I come from AI, from robotics. My background is in AI. I've been working for years in the field of artificial vision. And at a certain point in my academic life, I realized that nothing in AI tells us anything about experience. Let me make you just a simple example. This is a phone. This phone is able to recognize my face. It is so reliable in recognizing my face or other people's faces that we can use face recognition as a way to lock our phones. So it must be quite good in doing that. But this phone that is able to recognize my face doesn't see me, doesn't have an experience of me. So if I go back home, I get naked, I take a shower, and I put my phone in front of me, I don't feel observed by my phone, although my phone recognizes me. My phone is able to tell that that face in front of the phone is that of Riccardo Manzotti and not someone else. So this is just to make you an example. Why don't we work like a phone? Why don't we do everything we do just like a phone, just like a function? We have an experience of the world. So in order to reply, in order to find an answer to this question, I started a kind of treasure hunt. I've been looking for the nature of consciousness inside science, inside neuroscience, inside what we know about hallucination, dreams, even memory. And then we will see that there can be a solution in a very unexpected place. And actually, I will claim that the reason why science today has big trouble in finding out what is consciousness, it is because science is looking in the wrong place. There was a joke, a very old joke. There's a drunk guy who's going home and he's looking for the keys. And he's looking for the keys under the light of a street light. And they ask him, why are you looking for your keys there? You didn't lose them in that place. And he replies, yes, but that's where I see better. I believe that now science is doing just like that. It's looking for consciousness in the brain. Why? Because science has many tools to investigate inside the brain. But that may be the wrong place to look for. So that's a fact. This is something that I could claim everywhere. In the last 150 years, neuroscientists have not been able to find anything that suggests the appearance of consciousness in the brain. Everything we know about neurons doesn't predict the emergence of consciousness. Of course, we know that there are plenty of correlation between what's going on in the brain and our consciousness. In anesthesiology, people have been very good at predicting whether one is conscious or not. But these are all correlation. So we know that when we have some kind of neural activity, usually the person is conscious. But that's completely different from explaining what is consciousness. And if we look inside the brain, actually, there isn't anything like our conscious experience. There are neurons, there are neural spikes, neural activity, glia, cells, a lot of chemicals, but nothing like our own experience. So if you look at the explanation in a scientific book, this is Christoph Koch, 2004, The Quest for Consciousness, you see more or less this picture. There is an external world, for example, with the dog. Then there is a complex chain of phenomena getting into the brain. And then there are even more complex activities going on in the brain. But all of a sudden, all that activity that is nothing like our own experience becomes, again, the dog. And nobody knows how the last step takes place. It is so difficult that a philosopher like David Chalmers called this problem the hard problem, to mean that it is so difficult that nobody will ever be able to explain. How is it that the neural activity at the very end of that complex neural process becomes like our everyday experience? Right now, you don't have an experience of neural activity. You don't see what your neurons do. You don't see what's going on in the brain. You have no idea you have a brain if they didn't tell you at school. What do you see in your experience right now? You see jackets, faces, people, bodies, columns. You see this church. You see me. Or better, you see my body, which is different. How is it possible that all this stuff fits inside your head? If in your head, in your brain, there isn't anything like this stuff that you're having an experience of. You're having an experience of this church. How is it possible that this church fits inside your brain? The traditional picture is more or less like that. This is an allegory, kind of a metaphor, but it is not mine. It is by a famous psychologist like Skinner, and it is the standard view in neuroscience today. Namely, we get information, we swallow information from the external world, and then we digest this information, and we call this digestion of information processing, or computation, or number crunching, and then nobody knows how the information becomes color, sounds, tastes, smells, and whatever. How is that possible? Nobody has a clue. And finally, there's another problem that no one is able to explain, which will be very important tonight. The problem of the present. We live in the present, but how big is the present? So if you accept the standard view that present is like a point on the arrow of time, that's a big problem because nobody fits in a present so thin. And in fact, everything we are familiar with, my gestures, my voice, a piece of music, would disappear if we were just a point in time. Even light. Usually in the movie you have this picture that if you could freeze time, everything would just remain as it is, only it would be frozen. But that's not what it would happen. If you froze time, even light would disappear. Why? Because light takes time. You know that. Light takes time to go from the external world to our eyes. So if we froze time, everything would disappear. And in the brain, everything takes place. So how can we explain what we are? How can we explain how we get outside of our body? If we were really a brain inside a skull, if we were really in the pitch dark of the body, how could we get to the external world? That's a mystery. And that's a mystery that it is even greater if we accept the standard view in science. The standard view in science is more or less that we are one and the same with neural activity in the brain. Philosophers of mind like Smart or Armstrong in the 50s said that we are nothing but our neural processes. What are our sensations? They are neural processes. And then they started a research program that went on for years and that has not been able to explain anything so far as regards consciousness. So I ask you to reconsider the premise, to reconsider a premise that it is so entrenched in our culture that we often forget that it is there, and it might be wrong. This premise is the idea that we are inside our body. But now let me ask you. So let me get back the object, my favorite object, the apple. Now, we are all looking at an apple, right here. And if you look at this apple and I ask you, what is your experience made of right now? I'm sure that you would say that in your experience you find what? An apple. You find something red, round, appish, shiny. Now, this is your brain. First you asked if someone brought a brain. I did. Let's suppose for a moment that this is your brain. Now, look at this thing. And now look at the apple. Of these two objects, which one is closer to your own experience of the apple? Is there right now here in this room an object that is very much like your own experience of the object? But it is not the brain, surprisingly enough. It is the apple. So, my idea, that may sound a little bit crazy at first, is that we have always believed to be in the wrong place. We have believed to be inside our body because we base our belief on the idea of being a ghost, of being a soul, of being a spirit, of being a neural activity, of being information. all stuff that no one has ever seen. But my suggestion is that we could change our perspective and let's take into consideration whether we are one with the external world. So the proposal that I make, which is very radical at first, is that we are not a brain, we are a world. We are an object which is right there in the external world. Whenever we watch and we have an experience of something surrounding our body, we are made of that something. So, just to make it clear, science so far has been looking for ourselves, our experience, the stuff we are made of inside our brain. What if the stuff we are made of was outside our brain? Was it there, in front of our nose? And that's why no one has been able to find anything like our own experience inside the brain, because it was not there. Neuroscientists have been looking for something resembling, for example, the properties of the apple when we perceive an apple inside the brain. And they've not been able to find anything like that. They found only neural activity which takes place whenever there is an apple in front of our nose. But they haven't found the apple. What if we are the apple? This would allow us to have a completely different idea of what we are. It would allow to place ourselves in the external world. Now, this idea has two big obstacles. The first is what I would call the subjective variability. Namely, the fact that often people perceive the apple in different ways. You may be colorblind, and you may not see the color of this apple. I may feel it warm, and you may feel it colder, maybe, because you kept your hand in a warmer place. And so we know that we all perceive reality in a different way. So that would seem to go against the idea that we are all made by the same apple. But I will show you that this is not an obstacle. But first, let me also anticipate the other obstacle to this theory. What does it happen when we dream of an apple and there's no apple? When we have a memory of an apple and there's no apple? When we have a hallucination of an apple and there's no apple? In all such cases, the brain seems to be a much better candidate, because it seems that the brain is always there to produce our internal mental world. Let me try to show you that those two apparent obstacles are not obstacles at all. First of all, let me start with the problem of subjective variability. So, how is it possible that this apple is different for each of us if we are made by the same apple? And actually, it's very simple. Think for a moment about a simple property, physical property for this apple: speed, velocity. Let me ask you, is this apple still or moving? It is still relative, for example, to the floor. It is moving relative to the moon. If you were walking in this room randomly and chatting, your body would be moving, and this apple would have a different speed for each of our body. Actually, right now, this apple, according to physics, not according to me, according to physics, is moving in all directions. Why? Because in this room there are umpteen molecules in the air. They're all moving at a different speed, and relative to each of these molecules, this apple is actually moving. So, how many velocities has this apple? Umpteen, infinite, many, many, many. Likewise, so we are not committed to believe that this apple has only one velocity. This apple may have many velocities, relative velocities, but in physics there are only relative velocities. Likewise, let's consider color. Now, behind me, you can see a white patch. Let me get back. Okay, you can see a white patch. But you know that a white patch on a computer screen is made of red, green, and blue little lights. If you get closer to that patch, or if you, for example, on your computer at home, you get very close, you may see the light, the colored light, the white patch is made of. Is the patch white or colored? It is both. It is white relative to a human eye at more than 1 meter of distance. It is colored relative to a human eye at less than few centimeters of distance. It is both. And relative to other physical systems, it may have even different colors. Let's consider another case. This is the place where I come from, in Italy. This is the beach where I stay close to my home. Now, you can see the path of light, the sunset. But is it really there? Or if you move, the path of light is going to move with you. Actually, if you move, the path of light would follow your body. That's because all of the sea surface is glittering in the same way. We see only one sunset among of infinite sunsets that are taking place all together. Each beholder, each person, each pebble on that beach has their own sunset, their own path of light. Only we can see only one. But that's only because out of the thousands of the millions of relative sunsets, only one exists for us. And the same happens for many other phenomena. The rainbow is another straightforward example. When we look at the rainbow, each person is going to see a different rainbow. If we had raindrops, they will all reflect all of the colors of the rainbow. But a subject would see only one rainbow at a time. That's why if we move, we will see a different rainbow. And actually it is impossible to see someone else's rainbow. Even if we are two lovers and we are watching a rainbow and we are very close, we would be in two slightly different points in space. Because our body, no matter how close they might get, they would never be exactly in the same place. So it is impossible to see someone else's rainbow. So this is to say that the external world is much richer than we usually thought, than we usually think. The external world is not just one, but it is made of infinite versions. There are infinite rainbows, infinite sunsets, infinite colors, infinite relative velocities. And they are all there in the external world. We can perceive only one out of these infinite relative worlds. But that doesn't mean that those worlds are not there. Why do we see only one? That's a little bit similar to the fridge light. When we want to know whether there's a fridge light, we have to open the door. But by doing that, we bring into existence only one particular fridge light, which is always there when we need it. That's why we may believe that the fridge light is always there, even when our body is not there. But the fact is that the external world we are familiar with is there only relative to our own body. Our body brings into existence a particular version of the external world. And if you want to convince yourself of that, think about this fact that everything that takes place around you is just the right phenomenon to be in relation with our own body. We see light because we have eyes. We hear sound waves, but we have ears, and so forth. But there's plenty of phenomena which are surrounding us, we are completely oblivious to. Electromagnetic waves, infrared, neutrinos, and so forth. So, is it not surprising that the world that we believe to be there when our body is not there is just the right word to be created, like the fridge light, by a body like our own? So once we take that into consideration, we see that the body has the same role that has a dam with a lake. The dam is the condition for the existence of a lake, but it doesn't create a lake. If we built a dam in the desert, a 1 mile high dam in the desert, there would be no lake. We need other conditions, but with the right terrains, with the right mountains, with the right amount of rain, a dam will lead to the existence of a lake. Likewise, in the right condition, a body like ours will bring into existence a world like the one we are familiar with. And this has been claimed by many philosophers in the past, and by many scientists actually. But to cut a long story short, the basic idea is that to exist is to be able to produce effects. And that's just what our body does. Our body allows the external world that surrounds our body to exist. Our body brings into existence a world, and we are that world. Rather than being the outcome of our brain, like a secretion, like something that is produced by our brain, we are the world that surrounds us, that takes place thanks to the existence of our body in a certain point in time and space. So, the traditional idea was more or less the following. The world exists in many different versions. This apple has many colors. Maybe each of you sees the apple as having a slightly different color. And so, the traditional approach of science was to choose one apple among the many relative apples and to say that that was the objective apple, and to throw all the others inside the mind. This is a traditional picture, but no one has ever been able to find those 4 mental apples in anybody's brain. And I present a completely different approach. Those apples are not inside our heads, where no one has been able to find them. Those apples are all there, like relative velocities. They're all there, surrounding our bodies. And they all exist just in the same way. They're all there. So that's why we perceive differently the external world. Because there are different external worlds, each relative to our own body, which is slightly different from everyone else's body. So, by doing that, we can get rid of the obnoxious notion of subjectivity. Being subjective is not like idealists thought it is being relative to a subject. It's simply being relative to a subject's body, which is just an object. So we can remain in the physical world. And now let me address the second objection. I'm sorry if I have to hurry up a little bit, but I want to provide you with the complete picture of this new worldview, of this new view to see ourselves and the world. Because after all, we are part of the world. So in order to understand us, we need to understand the structure of the world. So what about those cases in which there's no apple at all? How can I, through a sleight of hands, invent a situation in which we can perceive an apple which is not there? Well, I will do it in 2 steps. The first step is to get rid of myth, the myth of the brain in a vat. From many movies, from US Calendar, Black Mirror, Matrix, and so forth, Altered Carbon, there are plenty of movies, we develop this notion that the brain is enough to create a world. But actually, this is a pure fantasy. There's no evidence of that. No one has ever been able to make a brain grow in a vat and to have anything like our own experience. So this is just a myth. There's no evidence of anything like that. And if we check what happens when people have their brain directly stimulated, we don't find anything like what we found in science fiction movies. What do we find? We find only triggering of memories, of past memories, or recombination of their past. So, for example, this is the report from Penfield. Penfield was the first surgeon that started to trigger, to directly stimulate his patient's brain with electricity. Today, the same is done in a less invasive way, but the principle is the same. And they never reported anything radically new. What they reported were just the rehearsal of past experiences, past moments. People saw their mom, their school, their high school, what they were doing, the familiar voices. Nothing exceptionally different. And the same holds true for all cases of hallucinations. They are never the creation of radically new content. They are always just the recombination of previous events. And this is important. Why this is so important? Because if our brain was able to create, for example, colors, sooner or later, our brain should be able to produce a color that we have never seen in the external world. If colors were created inside the head, sooner or later, either because of some condition or some mistake or some external stimulation of the brain, we should be able to see a color that we have never met in our life. That has never happened. Colorblind subjects have never had an experience of a color. Totally colorblind subjects have never had an experience of colors. Even Descartes, the champion of the autonomy of the mental, claimed that our brain is like a painter that in order to create a dream has to put together pieces of the external world. And so it is able to create a siren putting together a fish and the body of a woman, and so forth. So, I'm getting to the point. Let's consider for a moment another thing that we may think about. Memory. Right now, let me ask you, can you think about something, for example, I imagine that all of you have a sofa. So think about your sofa. Now think about, is there anything, you have to buy a new pillow for your sofa. So you have to think about the color of your sofa, because you want to know whether the new pillow is going to match. And so you need to have some kind of recollection. And so you may have this idea that there are things in the world, they leave traces, and then you have a recollection. But that's problematic. Let me explain you why. Let me make you another example. You have an event, it leaves a trace, and then you have the recollection of that trace. But let me ask you, does the trace look anything like your memory? No. The trace, the footprint, is completely different from your memory. Now, consider an analogy. A recipe. You see some nice food, then you write down a trace, how to get to that food, which we call a recipe, and then afterward you cook again those ingredients and you get again the same food. But in this case, there's which resembles a little bit the way in which we think that memory works. But there's a big difference here. In order to cook the food by means of the recipe, following the recipe, you need to have ingredients. You need to have spaghetti. You need to have tomato. You need to have basil. If you didn't have basil, spaghetti, and tomato, the recipe is not enough. You cannot eat a recipe. Now, that's what neuroscientists ask us to believe. They ask us to believe that we have external world, then we get neural recipe in the brain, and then our brain is able to cook the mental food without the ingredients. But that is impossible, because the brain doesn't have colors, doesn't have shapes, doesn't have smells to put together those ingredients. It doesn't have the right ingredients to do that. So how is it possible that we have anything like memory? And the explanation is...
But I think no neuroscience claims that you can sit in your memory of the sofa, and that's what I'm kind of getting from...
No.
You're saying now.
No. Good question, good question. Good point. We cannot sit on my memory of my sofa, but I cannot have a visual experience of an image. And that's a problem enough. So just let me make you another example. We have traces in, for example, in our phone, right? So I took a picture of you, and then tomorrow I can switch it on and I can see you again. But in order to do that, this screen has to produce a physical image. It has the ingredients. It has light, it has color, it has shape. In the brain, there isn't any screen in which the visual experience of the world can be projected. And that's a mystery, but good point. So how can we solve that? In order to solve that, we need to peer inside the structure of reality once again. Not inside the structure of ourselves. We need to understand what the world is made of. And here, the key point is time. So in order to understand subjective variability, I ask you to take into consideration relative velocity, relative properties. Now, in order to understand memory and hallucination, and how is it possible that we may have an experience of something which is no longer here, I need to ask you to consider a key issue: time. And time, if you think about, is one of the things we are made of. We exist in time. Our life is made of a flow of events. We cannot stop. We're like a shark. If we stop in time, we stop to exist. Like the example that I made at the beginning. If we froze time, everything would disappear. We would disappear. To exist, we need to take place in time. So, what do I want to say right now? A very simple thing. Here I have an apple. Is this apple in my now, in my present? Is this apple in our present? Are you having an experience of this apple now? Yes. What if the apple went farther away? And rather than being an apple, in order to be visible, it had to be much larger, like the moon. Well, the moon is basically a much bigger apple. Well, we could continue to see the apple, and the apple, which in this case would be the moon, would still be in our present, only it would be 1.3 seconds away. Why? Because light takes time to reach our eyes. But that is true also with everyday perception. Do you know what is the time delay between what you think to be in your now and the neural activity in your brain? It is no less than 150 milliseconds. And it can be even longer. Well, sometimes it may be a little bit shorter, but let's say that a good average is 150 milliseconds, which may seem very little to you, but if you were a computer, it would be a very long time. Your computer can do billions of operations during those 150 milliseconds. And what if the apple went even farther and farther away? 150 million kilometers, like the sun. Well, the sun was there until a few minutes ago, and that sun was in our present. we saw that sun just like we see the apple. Only this time, the time delay is 8 minutes. So, why this example should make any difference for what we are? Well, let me make it very simple. A very simple example. Because like we assume of being in a point in space, so we assume to be in a point in time. And that led to infinite problems. So if we have this structure of reality, that's the naive idea, that we are in a point in space-time. You can see my face, that's my body, and we expect that everything we perceive has to be at the same time. That's false. Because what is really happening is something like that. That's not the present. That's a very naive, simplistic idea. That's what it really happens. The external world is spread in time as well as in space. How much? How much it needs. There's no boundary. But because we believe that we have to be in a particular point in time, we developed the idea that we had to be, that everything we had an experience of had to be at the same point in time. So we developed the idea that the things we are made of had to take place just at the very point in time. So we developed the idea that there had to be mental versions of the external world, mental copies of the external world. But is that necessary? Not at all. Because from physics we know that phenomena can be spread in space and in time. Actually, even if we were a hardcore neuroscientist who believes that everything takes place in our brain, we would have to admit that we are physically spread over 150 milliseconds. Because that's the time that our brain needs in order to have a minimum conscious experience. And in that period of time, neural signals travel through 150 meters. Neural processes are all wrapped up inside our brain, but during 150 milliseconds, they go through 150 meters of neural wirings. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is once again to get outside of the dungeon, of the cage of our head. And there's no reason why it should not be made of the external world. So we are not ghosts inside our brain, but rather we are the objects wherever and at any time they take place. Why should not be made by those phenomena, which are just the phenomena that are taking place inside, that are producing an effect inside our brain, but themselves are not inside our brain. And likewise, the proposal is that we don't have a naive now. When I remember where I've been in the last few weeks, I've been in Bulgaria, I've been in Tel Aviv, I've been in Italy, in Rome, and in Lavagna, in many different places. I don't need to have a mental copy of those places, but I may simply think of being made by all those events, at any time, in any place, they took place. So to get to the conclusion, the idea is that when we perceive the world, our present is not a naive point in time, but is spread. It may be spread a lot, 8 minutes for the sun, hundreds of years for faraway stars, few milliseconds for the apple. But they're all spread. When we get asleep, so the proximal surrounding environment is no longer that pressing, the past environment is still active through our brain, and we can perceive our past. In whatever combination it produces effects. So the idea is that memory, not the impressive performance that we've just seen, which is a mechanism that in principle may take place even without conscious awareness, although we take advantage of our conscious experience. But the idea is that memory, dreams, and hallucinations are all different ways to perceive our past in different combinations. So, that's the end of my very radical hypothesis. This is what I call the space-time chessboard. I'm a physicalist, so I believe that everything has to be physical. That's why I like very much the proposal in neuroscience that our experience has to be inside the brain. B, in that place in space and time. Only no one has been able to find anything like our experience of the apple inside B. And that led to a apparently unsolvable mystery. So, luckily, we have another option. Another option that I reached after I spent 15 years of my life trying to rule out all other possibilities, basically. The other possibilities, no matter how strange it may seem, is the only one that makes sense with available empirical evidence and with our own subjective, personal experience of the world. Namely, that the thing we are made of is not the brain, but is the apple. It is the external object, which has all the right properties we expected our experience to have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manzotto, for your interesting talk about this very new subject, the spread mind. There will be a few minutes break and then we'll start